Hey, greetings, peace, and salutations, beautiful people. I hope this finds you as well as humanly possible amidst the madness of it all. Dr. Cornell West reminds us that the person who has never despaired has never lived, but we must not let despair have the last word. Welcome to the Paper Plane. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself, Colin Masashi Rohahio Ehara, where I interview folks I am blessed and honored to share community with, asking them about a book or books that have had a transformative impact on their lives. In a society where literacy rates are steadily declining, and a growing number of podcasts hosted by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity that come at the expense of women, femmes, female-bodied folks, LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit Plus, and especially BIPOC people, this space, imperfectly, I will make mistakes, aims to operate as a counter to those things. The paper plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and of course, literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. Today's guest is a dear friend and mentor that I met over a decade ago in the University of San Francisco's teaching urban education and social justice master's program. Whether schlepping me across the Bay Bridge to graduate seminars or connecting me with brilliant veteran educators like Amy Crawford and Dana Moran in Berkeley High School's Communication Arts and Sciences Small School, where I jumped into student teaching, today's guest is someone I lovingly refer to as Sensei and Uncle due to his profound wisdom, patience, support, perpetual reflection, and contagious courage. Dr. Rick Ayers is an associate professor of education focusing on English language arts and secondary education and a faculty member of the Urban Education and Social Justice cohort at the University of San Francisco. Professor Ayers received his MA from Mills College, his Ph.D. from UC Berkeley, and focuses on language and literacy as well as curriculum and pedagogy, with particular emphasis on equity, social justice, and decolonial approaches to education. His writing and blogs, as well as publications, is on community engaged scholarship and community organizing. Rick was an anti-war and anti-racist activist in the 1960s and 70s and a cadre in the Weather Underground. Rick lives in Oakland, California with his wife, Eileen. He spends time with his three children and three grandchildren as much as possible. He taught in the Communication Arts and Sciences Small School at Berkeley High School, where he pioneered innovative and effective strategies for academic and social success for a diverse range of students. Rick was a core team member of the Berkeley High School Diversity Project. He is the co-author with his brother, Bill Ayers, of Teaching the Taboo, Courage and Imagination in the Classroom, now in its second edition, is co-author with Amy Crawford of Great Books for High School Kids, a teacher's guide to books that can change teens' lives, and is author of Studs Terkel's Working, a teaching guide, as well as numerous chapters and journal articles. He has worked with Youth Radio, Youth Speaks, Voice of Witness, and other community and arts organizations, and currently teaches a poetry seminar at San Quentin Prison. And it is my honor, my pleasure to invite you to have on the pod um, my mentor, my big brother, my Uncle Rick. Rick, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate you very much. How are you?
Colin, it's good to see you. It's been a while.
I
Yeah,
know, I
you're
know.
always an inspiration to me. So
Oh my goodness. That means a lot. And I'm just so happy to be in your presence, even if it's via the Zoomies. But really excited to kind of get into things and to talk story with you about this tremendous text. And so today, uh, Dr. Ayers has chosen to discuss the brief, wondrous life of Oscar Wilde, which is a 2007 novel written by Dominican-American author Junot Diaz. Although a work of fiction, the novel is set in New Jersey in the United States, where Diaz was raised, and it deals with the Dominican Republic's experience under dictator Rafael Trujillo. The book chronicles the life of Oscar de Leon, an overweight Dominican boy growing up in Paterson, New Jersey, who is obsessed with science fiction and fantasy novels and with falling in love, as well as a curse that has plagued his family for generations. And we got curse in quotations. Narrated by multiple characters, the novel incorporates a significant amount of Spanglish and neologisms, as well as references to fantasy and science fiction books and films. Its overarching theme of the Fuku curse also contains elements of magical realism. It received highly positive reviews from critics who praised Diaz's writing style and the multi-generational story. The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde went on to win numerous awards in 2008, such as the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. And just a quick content warning that spoilers will abound in this if you have never read this book. And also a piece around content warning, we will be discussing the themes of colonialism, fascism, displacement, immigration, militarization, war, sexism, patriarchy, male domination, gender violence, white supremacy, and generational trauma, just to name a few. And to jump
That's
into
a that's
things,
a quite
I
a
know
few
that's
warnings.
quite and this seems to be kind of the themes that I speak to pretty much every conversation I've had so far in this pod, with the text that different people have chosen. But I'm going to begin with this opening question for you. Why is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde an important text to you, and what journeys would you say it's taken you on?
Thank you, Colin. That's a great opening. You know, when you asked me to pick a book, it took me a long time. I went around and around, and I even came up with a book at 8 years old called Professor Peckham's Adventures in a Drop of Water, which was the first book that blew my mind.
Oh, wow.
But I decided on this text just because there's so much to talk about. It's only 20 years old, and I was trying to find a book that shaped who I am, and it seems weird because in my life, 20 years old is pretty recent.
Mm,
But it was very important book to me because it has informed in deep ways my teaching, both in high school level and at my university and scholarly work. It even deeply informed my Ph.D. dissertation at Cal.
wow.
I think what happened was, I was, of course, interested in Freire and democratic education. And it was in 1998 that this big Ebonics debate blew up in Oakland. I don't know if you
Hmm.
remember. The
Yeah, I
Oakland
do.
School Board decided to recognize Ebonics as a language, and people went crazy. And it was all kinds of code language about this is stupid. You know, Black English is stupid. Why would we allow this in school? It just holds them back because they need to learn standard English. And I got caught up in that debate and reading very serious works by people like Teresa Perry, Lisa Delpit. And I recognized that the issue of discourse and who has power and who gets to say the right way to say things is
Mm,
a big deal, and it goes back in our culture forever. George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion is about this guy plucking a working class woman who speaks Cockney in London and says, I can teach her to speak properly, otherwise she'll be in the gutter the rest of her life.
mm,
And so that whole narrative about social capital of sort of white middle class English is an important impediment to education, in my opinion.
hmm.
So this thing comes out. A couple of other things came out too. Sea of Poppies by Amitav Ghosh, where he integrates um, in different Indian languages. But this one, through so many languages and references at you so quickly that besides even it's anti-colonial in itself just by
Mm,
doing that. But it just kind of blew my mind um, how bold it was
mm,
in crossing barriers. And I heard him say in in an interview that he wanted to destroy the master narrative.
yeah,
Because school English and the five
yeah,
paragraph essay that really ruins young people's ability to write.
yeah.
Um, so I've always struggled for a kind of writing instruction that was idea centered, not structure centered. Get to your ideas, and we'll figure out how to
Mm,
make your ideas come across. But he was very intentional in saying, "Screw you to this," and um, and of course, then it's sort of a collage of a million different things.
mm,
But this is a time in the early 2000s of a blowing up of art that was critical of the single story. You
Sure.
know, I don't know if you've seen the artwork of Enrique Chagoya. Got a thing called Borderlandia, and
Okay.
he does this artwork that will be like Aztec codex next to a Superman cartoon, you know, and kind
Uh,
of speaking to
yeah.
the conquest of Mexico and the early history and pop culture. So he was doing that. Chagoya was doing this at the same time as Junot Diaz was writing this. So they were onto something, and I think um, it's an example of art which captures the moment and also changes the world.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And just actually the last person I interviewed, who I think you know, Danny Cornejo.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Yeah, so and we were talking about Miranda's Bad Indians and Tommy Orange's novels, but you know, it just immediately made me think of kind of that you said collage, but I was thinking of like the mosaic, right?
Yes.
And these different pieces, right? And colonialism's impact and like breaking things and putting things back together, not necessarily exactly as they were, but in these ways that make the most sense to folks. Um, but yeah, I love that. And then
Uh,
thinking,
can I add
yeah,
something?
yeah, please go for it.
Okay, so there's, you know, this contrasts to certain books that I hate, so I'm going to make some people angry. But
Go for
one
it.
book that I just hated was Bel Canto by Anne Patchett. And here's the
Never read
story
that.
of these people in an unnamed Latin American country who are caught in a building by the terrorists, these guerrillas. And first of all, the terrorists are characterized as having no mind at all. They have
Mhm.
no understanding of what they're doing.
Yeah.
They're just blank slates. They're just the third world other. And they have these people, they're teenagers and they got guns. But there's one of the women who's a hostage, is a opera singer, and she sings these beautiful songs. And slowly, these young teenagers become enchanted by her,
Hmm.
and she civilizes them with opera singing. And it's the most racist,
Yeah.
it's the white fantasy. If I could only sing opera to these people who hate us, And so there's so many of these things that are kind of the white gaze.
Yeah.
I could go on and on of pieces that piss me off, but there's also a thing. The novel itself is a kind of Western European invention, and it's lovely, but it has a lot to do with the European way of seeing things,
Yeah.
and some things that when we're teaching world literature that they have us read are basically European stories with some color, like Joy Luck Club.
Hmm.
Lovely book, but it's definitely the format of a
Yeah.
Western.
Sure.
Things Fall Apart, which I don't think is great. It's guy went to Oxford. It's sort of a Greek tragedy written with Igbo characters.
Mm.
So how do you get to the real culture of people and the anti-colonial picture of it? So I would try to do that. I would try to introduce, Lady Murasaki, The Tale of Genji, or something that was indigenous before the European gaze.
Mhm.
Or we would do the Tang Dynasty poetry from China, because that's a way to look at China way before the so-called novel, instead of just
Yeah.
giving us an easily digestible Western novel with Chinese characters. Why
Mm.
not look at Tang Dynasty poetry, which kids really liked, and they learned something really about the world? Okay,
Mm.
so here's Junot Diaz stuck with the novel, but trying to do something that obliterates the conventions, and
Yeah.
it's playful, it's hilarious,
Yeah.
and that's what I appreciated about it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I really appreciate like I think I can't remember what book it was, but that was like it was a long time ago. And I remember you pointing out it might have been The Vagrants by Yi Yun Lee, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken, but it was like I had recently read it and there was facets of it that that felt super interesting to me. And then I think I might have lent it to you or bought it for you. But I remember something that you highlighted for me that I like hadn't really um, noticed in the first round with it was just like the ways that particularly the characters that were poor, right, how they were positioned as like just like being just like dumb or like yeah, being like just like incapable of like deep thought. And and I think when you put that on my radar, it really helped, and this was probably 10 years ago, if not more than that at this point. But I remember that moment because it allowed me to kind of like, it turned on this like light, in, I think, particularly in examining literature for looking for that and those patterns. And so I just wanted to thank you for that. But then also maybe a follow-up question is, Diaz, you were speaking to this already, but like Diaz, wins the Pulitzer. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he's like the first Latinx man to ever win the Pulitzer for literature. What do you feel like he was able to do where he still has this kind of decolonial, way of approaching the novel while also, doing it to this degree where he's like getting awarded by this, very, very, kind of historically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant wealthy, organization.
Yeah, good point. First of all, I want to thank you for remembering the Yiyun Li moment because I remember that discussion too very
Oh,
well.
okay.
It's so interesting. I hadn't thought of it before we got on the line here, but that's that's cool. Um, yeah, well, Ta-Nehisi Coates also won it. So I think the Pulitzer was having a moment,
Yeah. Yeah.
that does happen. It doesn't mean, if you get the Nobel Prize or something, or if you get the Pulitzer, doesn't mean you're terrible necessarily. And it could mean you've got some good things going.
Mhm.
Um, but so I do think that, well, as we know, and I think we'll talk about it later when we talk about gender stuff, Diaz himself has a lot of issues and a lot of struggles that he both talks about and enacts. So that's something going on there. But
Mhm.
it's I think that he was able to. He had a project of wanting to write for his own people, and for people who are outsiders. On the other hand, he's an academic at MIT, and he makes references to Aeschylus. He makes references to William Butler Yeats. There's things you don't
Yeah.
catch unless you happen to know that. He'll say, "A
Sure.
terrible beauty is born." Well, that's from a Yeats poem,
Yeah.
or he'll make a reference to Doris Lessing. So he's got sort of high culture references at the same time. The comic book. I think he's actually happy to move between all these worlds. And I think it did blow people's minds. Just like Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't think any of these white people believe in reparations, but he has
Yeah.
he has
For
made a
real.
full-throated demand for reparations,
Yeah.
and people can't deny it. It's so well done.
Yeah.
So that's sort of an interesting kind of dilemma about making art and how you do it.
Mm.
And you could say, hip hop started in the Bronx as outsider art, and then it then capitalism came along.
Mm.
This has happened to youth poetry. The youth poetry movement used to be so outsider, and it was like screw the schools, and
Yeah.
other stuff happens. I don't want to go into that in great
Yeah.
detail, but I do think
Sure.
there's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, this is kind of a good segue because I imagine we'll kind of go in and out to talking about the text, talking about Diaz, talking about relationships to teaching and all these things. But with regards to kind of colonial legacy and education, right, the novel extensively explores the impact of Trujillo's dictatorship on
Yeah.
generations of Dominican folks. And I'm wondering, how do you see colonial history, political trauma, and healing shaping educational experiences, particularly for marginalized students today?
Well, you know, the as you know, the sort of official purpose of education is to civilize the
Mm.
savages, bring people into the culture. Either, there's a particular education for those who are supposed to rule in the future, which
Mm.
is a lot more reflective curriculum of questioning. And then there's the curriculum for those who are supposed to buckle down and go to work, and that's an education of repression and worksheets
Yeah.
and like that. So education, and now because America decided we want to build more weapons and we want to build more tech power to beat someone else, it's all about STEM. But
Mm.
so those are all problematic. But the reason I love the classroom and the reason you love the classroom is because it's wiggly. It moves around. It's a
Yeah.
contended space. It's
Yeah.
a space where we struggle about what kind of world we're going to live in 10 years, 20 years. And the kids don't take it. So there's a constant power struggle,
Yeah.
and so decolonial education, I mean, on the one hand, there's the actual explicit, like ethnic studies. But even in that, you have to remember the fight for ethnic studies at SF State was for a very revolutionary curriculum.
For
It
sure.
wasn't just about, oh, there's Black people and they're actually really nice. It was about the history of uh, anti-colonial struggles. It's about the history of Africa pre-contact with Europe. It's about
Yeah.
Malcolm X. So really, when it came into the schools, it became a little bit domesticated. You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Even,
Yeah.
not the best ones. I mean, there's sort of more radical versions, but a lot of times ethnic studies is like, nah. So
Sure.
now it's being kicked out of the schools, which
Yeah.
is terrible. But on the other hand, it won't go away. People are
Hmm.
going to teach it outside of the schools. The
Yeah.
schools are just one place. People will teach it, they'll bring it up and fight for it in history class, but they'll also have their study groups. They'll have the
Yeah.
Mississippi Freedom Schools were in little shacks
Yeah.
outside of the school. So,
Absolutely.
I want to just say that like the true history is not going to be defeated.
Yeah.
When I was in school, I was in school in the 50s. All the books that we like now were banned. I
Yeah.
had a teacher who tried to do an after school discussion about what is socialism. He was
Mm.
fired.
Wow.
So we think we're in the worst time ever. And look at how I came out. I'm a communist, and it didn't give it, I didn't get it at school. So I'm
Yeah.
just saying the repression they're doing should make us worried and angry, but it's not like they control minds.
Yeah. Absolutely. Mm. Well, and that's another perfect segue into talking about some pieces around narrative and power. So, one of the main kind of protagonist, Junior,
Yeah.
his voice dominates the storytelling in this book and often framing Oscar's struggles, right? And I'm wondering kind of in what ways does this narrative structure reflect larger dynamics of power and representation in either literature and academia, in the classroom, in anything come to mind around that piece?
Well, let me just say um, that to make the narrator someone else than the author, although Junior's got a lot of the same issues that
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Junot
yeah,
Diaz has. And, this is how you lose her. It continues on.
for sure.
But, it's a good move to have the narrator like that. And I would just have to back up and say two books that are really disturb people are Huck Finn and Heart of Darkness. And
Yeah,
both of them are disturbing because the white narrator, which is either Huck or Marlowe,
yeah,
is a racist.
yeah,
But the thing I actually like those books, and the reason is because these are the reason people are pissed off about it because these are white authors telling on white people.
yeah. The
You want a white
transparency
author,
is,
you want a white author who leaves race out, you know, uh, he's lying because
yeah,
race is everywhere. So
yeah,
these people have a narrator who expresses racism, but the actual story exposes it. And, Heart of Darkness ends with the horror, which is in the heart of the Europeans. It's not the heart of Africa. It turns out he
Yeah.
looks, he says, oh, it's us that the horror is. So anyway, the narrator voice. So the narrator here, Junior, represents the kind of, uh, as he calls it, a domo mentality, a Dominican immigrant mentality with all the problems there, all the sexism, all of that. And there's a way he could allow that to be explored through that voice. And
Hmm.
I think it's a brilliant move.
Mm.
And Junior is endearing and he's kind of a problematic guy, and that's how it is. By the way, then notice, I think it's the second chapter, Lola gets her own chapter, and there's a
Hmm.
whole middle section that's all the women's point of view.
Yeah.
There's
Yep.
Lola, and then there's Belly,
Yep.
and so that is another thing. People always remember it as, oh, it's all these dudes trying to get laid, blah, blah, blah. But
Mm.
actually, there's a bunch of women stuff in there.
Yeah.
And Lola's an amazing character.
Oh man, absolutely. Mm. Um, well, and this, kind of follows what we were just kind of talking about, but Junior, often reinforces, what we would today probably call toxic masculinity, while also in ways like critiquing it or um, like doing things that maybe the reader might not expect. And
Yeah,
so Diaz himself has faced allegations of sexual harassment, verbal abuse towards women colleagues that
yeah,
seem to mirror some of Junior's struggles. And so I'm wondering a couple things. So wondering what you think around like how should educators and scholars navigate teaching his work in intersectional discussions of race, gender, power, while also addressing ethical complexities of maybe his personal conduct, in your
yeah,
mind?
yeah, for sure. I mean, for, you know, I think it's in some ways it's complicated, in some ways it's simple.
Mm.
There's no question that Juno Diaz was narrating himself in This Is How You Lose Her. So he's saying, I got these issues.
Yeah.
And if you read, like you can read in Wikipedia, a long explanation of all the allegations and what happened.
Yep.
I don't want to lessen it at all. It was definitely a lot of specific things. Many investigations were done and found not so much, but he was clearly inappropriate, I'm sure, with women. And that I mentioned to you earlier this amazing book called Monsters: A Fan's Dilemma by
Mm.
Claire Dederer. And she kind of wrestles with this question of author and art. And it's not so simple to say, oh, the art is independent, so the author doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Not at all. The author does matter. Woody Allen matters,
Sure.
it's and you can see it in his work. You can see it in Manhattan, his pedophilia.
Yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, you could go through just about everyone in history, and they have not only gender issues.
Yep.
What about we talk about all these American presidents as if they're some kind of important people when they've all been responsible for mass murder.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, we can, including Obama,
Yeah, absolutely. Every president.
so there has to be a way within this world of horrors that we look at sort of the discourse in our culture, and
Hmm.
and especially I think with the Me Too stuff, especially in theater and in film, part of it is actual safety. People want to call this out so they're safe on the set.
Mm.
So these are real issues, but I think I thought, oh, I got to step away from Junot Diaz for a while. And
Mm.
then as I saw him coming back and writing more and talking about what he, has always been bad about and what he's trying to do, and I've seen him in the culture a lot more, I'm like, okay, I still love this damn book.
Mhm.
So I'm willing to take, criticism about that, but I felt
Yeah.
like and when I chose this book to do it, I said, is this okay? I feel like, yeah, it's got to be okay.
I really appreciate you sharing, and I probably should have even led with this before asking the question that, I taught this book for years, right? And it's one of my favorite books. And when these allegations came out, I was in the middle of teaching the book, and really had to do a ton of wrestling, continue to, right? Not to the degrees that I did in that specific moment, but around just like, do I just completely stop? Do I like, what do I do? And so, this was before I had children, so I was able to put in a lot of long hours, like, and checking in with a ton of different people around their thoughts on different things, which was really helpful.
Yeah.
But essentially, decided to finish the book, but also simultaneously allow, kind of these other different options. So particularly like looking at, we looked at Zinzi Clemens and like, the piece that she wrote and we looked at, there were other Afro-Latinx women writers specifically whose like work we looked at that were kind of, writing about what had happened. We looked at, there was I think a letter that was published by women of color, I think professors
Mhm.
that were like, both wanting to ensure that Diaz, was held accountable for any transgressions that had taken place, but also were really wary of the ways that he was potentially being kind of um, discarded in ways that really mirrored kind of prison industrial complex ways of
Yeah.
disappearing, especially Black and brown men.
Yeah.
And so, it was, yeah, complex and challenging to say the least. And, I was even chuckling when you were saying a little while ago, like how in the classroom it's this like wiggly thing. Like, shoot, it was like, yeah, it was so many different things. And I also, I was like, had, certain, especially young women students who were like Latinx that were like, you know, and I did everything in my power to like, provide space for them to like voice, their feelings. And some were really, really mad, and and we had the the option to like stop reading it, right, and to like read these other things, specifically by particularly Afro Latinx, women writers that were writing about what had happened. But I just, I say all that to say that I, don't have answers that I continue to love this book and it's very important to me. And also, am still in this perpetual kind of reflection around like, um, yeah, not knowing what the quote unquote kind of best direction is around
Right.
how to, approach all of it, right? But that all said, like when you said that you might be, down to talk about this book, I was really excited because I've, been thinking about this kind of internally for so long. And also just like, I think so highly of you and just respect your mind, your grind, your heart, in profound ways. So yeah, thank you again for being down to have this discussion and
Well,
in-
yeah.
go for it. Go for it.
Well, I'm just saying what you just said and agonizing about it and struggling about it publicly is what we need to do. It's
Huh.
not like we need to present them with something clean. We need to put it out there and say, and this is the problem. And, I've taught this, of course. I've had many students and, um, Caribbean or Latin American women look up from the book and said, Mr. Ayers, I didn't know they could say this in a book.
Huh.
I didn't know they could say this in a book because the idea of the book as authority and the book as the man, that was something so liberating about it, And yeah, so we went on. I'm sure you know that I went on to create a unit on language and power, and we did a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
things to promote the vernacular and to critique it. And I also noticed that students can, I'm getting off into the language thing again. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
But students can code switch
Sure.
when needed. They talk different to grandma than they do to their friends.
Yeah.
And Lisa Delpit did this thing where she walked up to a group of kids outside the Cabrini Green um, housing project in Chicago.
Hmm.
Kids playing on the street, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. And They were talking, Ebonics, African American vernacular English, whatever. And she said, "Hey, can you guys talk like the X-Men?" And they busted into hypercorrect English.
Yeah, that's
It's not
great.
that they can't.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's a cultural identity. It's
Hmm.
in these the discourse. So
Yeah.
um, our schools do violence against kids by delegitimizing not just their language but their entire culture. I mean, discourse is more than words. It's also like how you how you tell a joke. What's funny? I'll
Hmm.
hear a white teacher do some sarcastic humor and the kids will take offense because he did it in a bad way.
Huh.
I'll also hear black kids tell a joke that's perfectly legit and the white teacher will take offense. So it's not
Huh.
only
Yeah,
language, it's also what's funny or how do you prove that something is true? Those are also culturally bound.
for
So
sure.
all of these things are negotiated and struggled out. This is the whole thing that Bakhtin and all those Russians in the early part of the century were doing. And by the way, when the university teaches Bakhtin or Voloshinov or these people, they try to take away their politics. These people were Marxist dialecticians. That's why they figured this shit out,
Huh.
right? And but they just try to, since we realize everything they said was right, we use it, but we try to extract it from them being, Bolshevik revolutionaries. But their point was there's no utterance you make that the other person just hears and understands. It's
Yeah,
a negotiation. The
absolutely.
listener is fighting with you. If the listener is a peasant and the speaker is a middle class person, there's a battle over what these words mean.
For
And
sure.
and that's actually if you can get with that, it makes education so much more fun. It makes the classroom like this democratic minestrone soup.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
too many people are just, wise words from the front. And I feel like that makes education dead. And school is so boring. We have these kids for 12 years on lock
Mm,
and they have to endure it. That's the main thing they learn. And
mm.
every time I see a classroom which allows those barriers to be broken, I see so much engagement and joy. And so, anyway, I'm getting off on that, but it's something about Juno Diaz that to me represents that kind of joy. I
Mm.
reread it for this podcast because I
Oh,
hadn't read it in
wow.
a while,
That's
and I
awesome.
was roaring.
Huh.
It's so funny and good for him.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I've read this book, at least 10 times probably. And like, yeah, just the spectrum of emotions, of human emotion. I remember feeling every single, without like every single, kind of aspect or affect, I should say.
Yeah.
Um, but let's see.
And could I add,
Yeah, please
it's
go for it.
like he points out that when you get a little lost in there trying to follow it, just keep going. You know, try to figure it out from context. This is
Yeah.
what the immigrant has to do in your country. You
Yep,
have to just
absolutely.
listen and pick up what you can instead of trying to decode and understand everything. You just roll with it.
Yeah.
Like when I go to a baseball game with Max, my son, he's watching a different game than I am.
Uh-huh.
He is so deep in it. He is seeing a little gesture from the third base coach. I'm just like, get a hit,
Yeah.
But I'm enjoying the game and he's enjoying the game. This is how
Yeah.
I feel about students reading. They
Mm,
can read on different levels and don't discount them because they're not doing your literary criticism shit that you learned in college. They're digging something. And so they're at the baseball game and you're at the baseball game. Your job isn't to turn them into junior literary critics. I don't think the author of a poem wrote the poems thinking, I can't wait till students analyze this and
yeah.
find um, the hidden symbols I put in here. That's not why they wrote it. They want
Yeah.
you to experience it. And
Absolutely.
I feel like teaching, I don't know, I feel like we often deaden the text rather
Uh,
than allow the students at it.
Absolutely. When, it reminds me, Ta-Nehisi Coates, calls reading this one-way interface, right? And talks about that so many folks are, like particularly, you know, uh, folks in power that are trying to, you know, uh, concentrate as much as they can amongst themselves, like being really, really fearful of young people being able to have these one-way interfaces and that being a huge reason why they're trying to ban books.
Yeah,
Um, and I love, the ways that you talked about, um, even going back to like what we were just talking about with Diaz, like I think something that helps me to have the fuel to continue wrestling through these things and find comfort in discomfort in my efforts to grow, and be better every day is um, um, how do I put this? Um, I mean, just knowing that, like despite all of my best efforts, like I'm an agent of the state. Despite all my best efforts, I am not immune to unconsciously being anti-black, to being sexist, to being homophobic, unconsciously, right? Despite, all the books that I've read and all these things and my close relationships with different people, right? And just like being able to, humanize myself and thinking about, I think some of what it felt like you've been alluding to is how do we remove the horns and the halos, from folks in the process of like as we examine all these different things. And going back to some of what you were talking about, so much of your work, and I hope you know this, right, has informed so much of my thesis at USF and my continued work today around, deconstructing, identifying, resisting, quote unquote, formal standard academic English supremacy in U.S. schools.
mhm.
Right. And so when it comes to, Diaz, right, he's weaving English, Spanish, pop culture references throughout the novel. And you were already speaking to this a little bit, but, I'm wondering how might code switching, hybrid forms of language and literature act as, acts of resistance, empowerment, particularly in educational settings, in your experience. And I want to shout out the Berkeley High slang dictionary.
Yeah, the slang dictionary, which we just made as a classroom project, and I just photocopied it, but it got picked up by the media, and then people were interviewing our students and stuff. But it was basically the students uh, brought in slang words, and we alphabetized it and made a dictionary. Um, the interesting thing, the media always wanted to know, the dirty words or drugs or whatever. But you know what? If you look through the slang dictionary, what all the words the kids brought in, most of the words, the one that had the most quantity was words for friends, because
Huh.
teenagers are
That's
really
true.
obsessed with friends.
Absolutely.
Money, homie, homeskillet, cuzzo. There's a million
Compa.
of them. You know, so that just kind of showed, you kind of from looking at language, you can also see the culture beneath it. But Colin, you raised that problem of being an agent of the state, and it is true. We're in this sort of repressive classroom with the, hall monitors and so on.
Mm.
And I've always felt like in school, because I came out of a very radical tradition and kind of outsider, way outsider. It took me many years. It took me till my 40s till I felt I could teach because, I was a restaurant cook because
Mm.
I felt like there was too much conformity in teaching. But once
Huh.
I got into it, I loved it, loved it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the point is, I learned that, yeah, you are an agent of the state. To walk in that room, you're an agent of the state. But say you're 50, 60% an agent of the state, if you're 30% an agent of liberation, they appreciate that so much because
That's
they hardly
true.
ever see that. So
1000%.
students read you. They read you up and down. And if
Yeah.
they see, it doesn't mean you walk in and say, "Hey, you're free. What do you want to do?" They don't know what to do with that because
Yeah,
they're used to 12 years of repression.
sure.
But if you have ways, you're constantly trying to find ways to allow, the the bird to get out of the cage,
Hmm.
then it happens, and the magic happens, all the time. That's why I love visiting classrooms. Everyone talks about this is a bad school, that's a bad school. I've never been to a school where there isn't some room I can walk into and something kind of beautiful happening, you know. So,
100%.
and you know, I teach a class at San Quentin.
Yeah.
Talk about agent of the state.
Mm,
90% of what you're doing is constrained by these
yep.
people are on lock. So should I not go in there because I'm too into freedom? No, you got to go in there, and they appreciate seeing you there, you know,
Mm,
and it was a, you know, doing poetry together.
I love that. Um, Slightly, kind of returning to the text itself. Um, and this is tied in with, kind of the pieces you're speaking to around identity. All right, but Oscar Wilde struggles with his racial, cultural, gendered, so many different identities, but one that I particularly appreciate is like his nerd identity.
Yeah,
Right. And so I'm wondering, in your mind, how might educators create spaces in urban classrooms that affirm diverse identities, particularly for students who might feel estranged or like outsiders in our school communities?
yeah. Well, you know, yeah, I love I love all the comic book stuff, and you know, I've loved Watchmen. I've loved
Hmm.
certain pieces, but there was a lot that went over my head on that stuff.
Yeah, me
But
too.
there's other readers who that was their touch point, you know. But yeah, I really think obviously you see people more and more bringing into the classroom graphic novels
Yep.
and stuff like that. But you know, students have a lot of creativity that's repressed in them. So, for instance, this goes back a long ways now for you, but for me it was a big deal when zines came out. It was kind of a punk thing,
Uh,
making a zine, and
sure.
you know, you wouldn't make a bunch of them, you'd make one and it would have handwritten stuff and collages, and zines was real cool. And you know, the funny thing is at my school, I introduced the zine project, and people
Mm,
could nerd out on whatever they cared about,
yep.
and some would be gender identity or queer um, exploration, and others would be race, or it could just be, you know, being into
Music.
old old movies or something.
Got it.
But what happened was some other teachers who I will not name got a hold of it, and pretty soon the zine project had a big rubric, and it required this and it required that.
Uh,
And it wasn't a fucking zine. Oh, excuse me. It
yeah.
was
Oh, you're good.
it
You're good.
was a it was an assignment that had the name zine, but you have to. The whole point of zine was to have no rules, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden I had a bunch of rules, and I no, I wasn't gonna throw a fit, but I had to laugh about
Yeah.
the the way the school took the zines and kind of screwed it up.
Mm.
So
Made it rigid and put it in a
rigid.
box.
Yeah, and
Man.
you get graded on it. Grade a zine. Come on now.
Yeah. Man, well, it's funny because it's like I have this final project for my students, right? And it is like nine different options.
Yeah.
And, because there's so many options, I didn't necessarily have a rubric for every single one of them. And I can't tell, I mean, it wasn't a ton, but I definitely had a handful of in every single of my five classes of like students being like, where's the rubric? I need the rubric so that I can, you could just immediately see, I say this as a recovering perfectionist myself, right? Like who was like, the good student and was like good at following rules and was like, I
Yeah.
need the rules, like tell me what the rules are. And my being like, just do your best and like they were like, what does that mean? And they were freaking out.
Even worse, man. What if you told them, you know what, do whatever. I'm going to give you an A. Oh man, that drives them crazy. Like, you mean I'm going to get an A? Some of them will disappoint you. They're going to go work on their chemistry, but a bunch of them will be like blown away by that. By you challenged yourself to get them to do it because they cared. I remember my friend Ringo Hallinan at UC Santa Cruz. I think he was there when you were there. He's a professor there. He led the student paper and did a lot of the freshman writing classes. Great guy. He died recently. Just a
Uh,
beautiful man.
uh,
Anyway, he'd tell a story about freshmen at UC Santa Cruz in the writing class, and he said a lot of the kids from the more elite and suburban schools or from the AP track would always raise their hand and say, is this going to be on the test? What do we need to do? How do we get it done right? And he said, a lot of the kids from Berkeley or from Cass, they'd raise their hand and say, I don't agree with what you're saying here. I want
Yeah.
to say this. And he said, oh, it was so refreshing because
Nice.
so much of the AP kids' writing was dull. It was
Yeah.
technically right and it was bad. So
Yeah.
there's got to be a way as a teacher, if you're teaching enrichment, um, you have to be able to say, okay, there's strengths these kids
Yeah.
have that the kids in Walnut Creek do not have. There's
Uh-huh.
things they know that the kids in Walnut Creek do not know.
That navigational capital.
Yeah, 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 and the community capital, and that's what I used to say when I advised the student paper. You're not just amateur journalists, you are youth journalists, and youth journalists see things that the adults don't see.
Yeah.
And so you have an edge here. Use it. Anyway, we're getting off of Juno, but it is kind of about the book
No,
too.
no. Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
exactly, it's that community knowledge, that you see, not only is there an ancient curse because of Trujillo, and he gives such a great political history of Trujillo, but there's tremendous anti-colonial survival
Yeah.
capacity, you know, there, that the book also celebrates, because what they pass down between them, what people learn from each other, is really how to survive. You
Yeah.
know, there's the Fuku, but there's Zafa, and
Yep.
Zafa is the pushback. And I really think, why does the book end instead of saying the horror, which was a white man's point in Africa? It says the beauty, the beauty.
Uh,
Jesus, after all of that pain, all of that suffering, all those beatdowns, life and love and being able to be in love um, is so beautiful. And
yeah.
that was such an affirmation. I teared up when I
Yeah. I
hit
remember
that
that
ending. You know what
vividly.
I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So that is a resistance culture to me.
Yeah. Well, you already started speaking to this, but right, so the novel suggests via, Fuku or, generational curses and Zafa, generational kind of counter spells to those curses that oppression, trauma, and healing can pass through generations. I was wondering what, if any, lessons or reminders have you gained from this book as someone who has seen and experienced many traumatic things in your life as an educator, activist, scholar, working towards liberation?
Um, you know, I okay, that's a great question. It brings up a lot of things for me. First of all, um, I feel like I've learned a lot. I still feel the need to sort of like say, okay, as a white boy myself, I need to sort of have a certain humility and recognition of, you know, the spaces that are not good, need to be worked on.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, as we, talking about Bel Canto, you talk about where's a white novel that's by a white person that's actually good? I mean, there's a lot that I like, okay, but I'm saying, okay, so here's an example. I was struggling with that. So I don't know if you know Adam Mansbach, but he's a local
Yeah,
guy, and
yeah,
he has
yeah.
a
I
great
read
book,
I read Angry. No, was it Angry?
Angry Black White Boy. Now that
Yeah, I read
deals
that.
with it straight up, man, straight up. There's so many things that are written to make white people feel comfortable or
Mm,
superior. So I like that a lot.
mm,
But I don't know. I don't know if it's Juno Diaz or my mother, which makes me have a certain kind of, uh, well, my mother calls it, she's got a Pollyanna complex, where she tries to see the positive. I see it a little better than that, more
mm.
kind of like trying to see what's possible and see the strength
Yeah,
of people of the world. So,
Yeah.
for instance, so many people are blown away by Trump, and I understand that it's a horrible, horrible time, and we're going to be in a horrible time
Yeah.
for quite a while. What I don't get down with is that kind of nostalgia for when the Democrats were in charge, because I don't think
Oof,
it's
1000% agree.
particularly different. Everyone's like, our democracy's gone. Our democracy? Wait a minute, what's that?
Yeah.
So I feel like if you have the long view and feel like, okay, America is this bloody empire and it's coming to a pathetic ending. In
Mm.
a way, I thought it could be done in a better way. I had a lot of good ideas how the empire could end, but
Yeah.
this is how it's ending by a
Mhm.
fool, a clown tearing everything apart. So it's going to be painful. And again, I'm not making light of it, but I'm
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah.
say that I feel from Juneau. I mean, there could be nothing more horrifying than living under Trujillo. I mean, anyone who whispers a critique um,
You
would
would be
get tortured in the
disappeared.
most
Yeah.
terrible ways. And yet, the beauty and the resistance that people expressed and ways of resistance was so beautiful.
Yeah.
And by the way, Rashid Khalid, who's one of the great Palestinian intellectuals in this horrible time around
Yeah.
Palestine.
Yep.
He says, I'm looking for so many ways of resistance, but I'm hopeful. The thing that makes me most hopeful is art, the arts of
Um,
resistance, the poets, the
wow.
artists. Um, and yeah, I get that. I really feel that. So I don't feel like teaching a novel or teaching poetry is some minor thing that's away from the real world. This is important deep stuff. And there is a culture of resistance. And you and I, Colin, we're part of it.
I'm honored you would include me in that, and yeah, I'm trying my best
Me too.
amidst the horrors and the beauty.
Mhm.
Um, and as you were sharing, and again, thank you so much for yeah sharing. I was thinking about one of your texts, an empty seat in the classroom,
Yes.
right? And thinking about I can't recall if I shared this with you, but this beginning of this past semester, I lost one of my most kind of beloved students that I watched from sixth to 12th grade, who was a sophomore at Sac State, was murdered in gun violence in Oakland in January. And I was thinking about what our role, can be, should be, has been in kind of, being in community, particularly with our students as they're, kind of dealing with those things.
Yeah.
And, I don't necessarily know if like, I mean, maybe, but like if it's like Zafa, like these counter spells, or like, trying to like think about healing, but yeah, the question that I have here is, how do you think that, educators and scholars can support students dealing with historical, present, familial trauma while, attempting to foster healing, in your
Yeah.
experience? And I know you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, I appreciate that because it's, this is no abstract thing. This is
Yeah.
another thing that bothers me about
Yeah.
a lot of Americans that I know wringing their hands about Trump is we live in this kind of American exceptionalism, like, oh, that shit's happening in this country and terrible stuff happens over there. And isn't it so bad what's going on there? Not us. We still drive our Prius and we still, and so in a way, we're feeling it. But you're right, students' death, that is a reminder that this is not just a conversation. This is real life and death
Yeah.
stuff that's going on in people's lives. And as you say, the kind of trauma that young people have living under capitalism, living under colonialism is real. So, how do you create a space, a community that th that gives hope? And you know, I have been, I'm not I'm not with this idea that healing and self-care is the main thing activists should be doing for themselves.
Mhm,
I've
mhm.
I've
Yeah,
gotten uncomfortable with that
yeah,
kind of idea that's sort of taken over. But as far as how to be with our students and how to be there, you know, and I'm sure you're very good at this, Colin, but you have to first be your authentic self. You lose a student, you're in pain, you're
yeah,
suffering. And you
absolutely.
can't hide that to be tough for the kids. In fact, that would show them the lesson that, hey, these adults don't care about us, you know. So you have to yourself suffer, but you can't suffer publicly so much that that they feel unsafe. So you also have to
Yeah,
hold that space. And
absolutely.
and what I've found, and you know, that book I wrote about students' death was partly because no one talks about it. Everyone experiences it, but no one has a conversation about it. I was really anxious to make it not a how-to book because there's no how-to,
Yeah,
but it was just to open up the conversation. But I have found that if you have built community, strong community with your students, then you have not only your students to fall back with for your own healing and theirs, but you have your traditions, whatever
um,
it is. We're going to do the circle. We're going to do the going out for that walk, the power walk, whatever you've done before, you then do it. And you have that. If you're that teacher who doesn't even really know everyone's name in your class and just, writes on the chalkboard and gives a test, you got nothing. You're not going to
mm,
help them and they don't even want you anyway. So, this is teaching is very political and it's very much community organizing work. You talk about what organizers have to do, the exact same thing teachers have to do. You have
yeah,
to listen. You have to listen more than you talk, and you have to help the group come up with ways forward. I mean, and this isn't to say that you're going to be the all-wise healer in the midst of trauma. It's
sure.
actually we're all just fumbling along, in the
Yeah.
mess. But if you're willing to fumble along in the mess, that's all they want out of you. They don't
Hmm.
want you to be the answer. They want you to be with them, you
Yeah,
know?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. So much, yeah, I appreciate about what you just shared. And I think what's coming to mind immediately is, yeah, like the what, feels like this wave of, I think, particularly on social media around kind of like wellness influencers and
Yeah.
specifically highlighting, right, self-care, right? And it feels very individualized. It feels very not critical at all of capitalism. It feels ahistorical. It feels colonial in that it regularly, whether intentionally or not, decenters, kind of indigenous ways of being and seeing with regards to community care and like centering, like how
Yeah.
do we think about um, healing in these ways where we're in this thing together. And I really appreciate the ways that you essentially named all those things. Um, this last question before we begin closing things out is very, very broad. And so it's kind of like a thing for you to be able to, if there's any other, things that you haven't gotten to share that you'd like to, that you could add because you've spoken to so many things in here. Um, is when it comes to right this text is as a tool or as a tool for social justice, given your incredible work in education and social justice, how do you see the brief wondrous life of Oscar Wilde as a resource for teaching about the intersections of race, gender, class, nation, trauma, healing, oppression, and resistance in the classroom?
Yeah. Well, the reason I like fiction more than sort of history texts, although I read a lot of history texts, the reason I like fiction is because it can get to deeper truths in a way that is beyond just the facts. It's beyond rationality,
Yeah.
and it gets to the sort of like collective subconscious. Um, and so I find a text like this, and I've also taught it a lot, with a lot of different students. I just find that it's an occasion for unleashing, just like we've done here today, unleashing all kinds of sidetracks, all kinds of um, different possibilities as to
Mhm.
where we're going to go. But the gender, I mean, the gender violence and also the sexiness and sensuality, they're both there.
Mm.
Um, are are things that I find teenagers, they're thinking about this all day,
Oh
but they're
yeah.
not allowed, they're not allowed to, they're not allowed
Mm.
to do it, they're not allowed to do it in the text or in the academic space. So, we talk about sex education in school. I'm just going to get off on this part for right now. And and so much sex education is about look out, danger. You might get
Yeah,
pregnant. You might
that's
get
true.
STDs,
Yeah.
and it's just another bunch of adults telling you what not to do.
Yeah.
But good sex education also talks about how great sex is and how important it is, and emphasizes the importance of choice, the
Mhm.
importance of power in sexual relations,
Mhm.
And I actually feel like this book, in my experience, has been the occasion to look at both pleasure and power and
Hmm.
and problems like that. And
Interesting.
Junior is so ridiculous in some ways around
Yeah,
sex,
off the
and
hook.
his language, is
Yeah.
is so explicit, and
Yeah.
and again, students appreciate that stuff they say in private is on the page,
Yeah,
and then
absolutely.
it really opens up discussions that are much more validating for young
Mm.
people, in my opinion,
Hmm.
than just the don't do this, don't do that.
Mm.
It's the ugly truth of, and most people get into bad relationships sometimes. And
Yeah.
instead of saying, don't ever do that, it's just saying, okay, so this is what happens. So this is what happens next.
Mm.
And you'll notice too, I mean, Lola's the best and Belly's great, but almost all the women in here, they kick these guys aside when they act a
Yeah,
fool.
absolutely.
So on the
Absolutely.
one hand, they act a fool. On the other hand, they get kicked aside. So I'm just saying that, say in the areas of sexuality and gender violence, this kind of text allows a really respectful engagement with students rather than just telling them what's right.
Mm.
Colonialism, of course, and Trujillo. Um, Also, I just can't leave without saying internal oppression within the colonized
Mm.
community.
Hmm.
And so I have a student actually that I worked with last semester from New York who's Dominican, and she did her a whole uh, journalism story on colorism
Yeah.
within the
Yep.
Dominican community and the Dominicans in New York. So if she goes back to the DR for the summer and comes back darker, people
Hmm.
say, "Oh, Mija, you look like a Haitian," because there's all this
Mm.
hatred of the Haitians who are
Yep.
blacker.
Yep.
And you saw a bunch of anti-Haitian stuff in the book.
Sure.
So colorism, I actually put her in touch with Juno Diaz, and he talked to her for an hour
Wow.
because she wanted someone who was an expert on this thing.
Wow.
So he was very generous with her. This is a high school kid.
Oh,
But so,
amazing.
things like colorism or, a lot of the oppression and bad things that happen to people in this book are Dominican on Dominican. It's not just Uncle Sam. It's like violence within the colony. So it really allows that kind of stuff. So you think about, you know, the father of a family who's violent and how to be able to see that as part of colonial oppression.
Mm.
That's deep, man. That's really deep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mm. Teaching the taboo. I love it.
Trying.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Rick. So I have two last questions for you, and these are questions I end with for every single episode. And the first is, and I know that we're both music lovers, what is a song, a musical artist, and or album that you might pair with this book?
Okay, you tipped me off that was coming, and I'm trying to think of something that crosses borders and it had to be at least Caribbean if I don't know
Mm.
Dominican. But first I was thinking of the last poets, you know.
Okay.
But I have to confess, I talked to my son, who's got a deeper playlist, and he
Mhm.
suggested Lee Scratch Perry
Oh, very cool.
because because his stuff is dub, it's sampling, it's
Yeah.
um, and it is at least um, something that breaks the rules, that changed the rules.
Yep.
And so I've been listening to that while I was getting ready
Mm.
for this, just thinking
Oh,
about
that's so
how
cool.
in different areas. So I would say Lee Scratch Perry and the piece I started playing. I don't want to give it too much, but it's called Disco Devil. It's really good.
Mm, mm. I love it. I love Lee Scratch Perry. My brother, who is a professional musician, put me on to essentially anything that's not hip hop or R&B, like many years ago. And Lee Scratch Perry is one of those artists.
Yeah,
Love
yeah,
that.
you can really, yeah. And he influenced a lot of
Oh my
others,
goodness.
including he sampled a lot in hip hop.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last piece is, if you could, I ask that you please complete the following sentence. I recommend reading The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde because dot dot dot.
Well, I recommend reading The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde because you will be taken on a journey of discovery and challenge and humor,
Mm,
and it will definitely expand your kind of understanding of cultural cultural
mm,
struggles for between different cultures. And I think, yeah, that's the best I can say.
mm,
You, if you haven't read it and you're checking out this podcast, please read it and give us some feedback what you thought.
Yeah. Rick, thank you so, so much for being with me today and hanging out and talking about this book. Continue to be so, so grateful for all your continued support, inspiration, motivation, and just all the love you put out into the world. So thank you again, Rick.
Thank you, sir. It was great to hang out, and we'll have to meet up in the Rich pretty soon.
I'll absolutely, absolutely looking forward to it already. Well, good people, thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and we hope you enjoyed the flight. Peace.